Professor Laura here. Evolution is a gigantic field, which is frankly really difficult to summarize into just one lecture. And of course, we're going to do just that. Like I said, today we're going to go over evolution kind of from a 1,000-foot view. What are the absolute basic things you know to understand evolution? Frankly, this was a really hard video for me to create because there is so much I love about evolutionary theory and like how can I cut all of this out? But sometimes you do really want that 1,000-foot view. What are the most important things to understand? So here I'm going to share with you some of my most important things that you should understand about evolution if you're maybe not going to go into this more. Please understand that this is a heavily cherry-picked lecture, and any single topic that I bring up, there are so many more details and interesting things that you can learn about that. But of course, let's talk about our goals for today. We're going to start off, of course, with what is evolution. Then we'll talk a little bit about Darwin's insights, and then we'll also cover the study of inheritance. There is much more that's happened since these guys, and I will include a few key terms at the very end if you want to learn some of the more modern discoveries. Of course, if we're going to talk about evolution, we first need to understand what it is. And one thing I like to do when I'm learning new words is I like to learn the etymology, and that is where that term comes from. What was the kind of the meaning of that word before we've given it this new definition? And for evolution, it means unfolding, which is a rather beautiful term because if you think of any of the depictions of the tree of life, and it's really this unfolding or unfurling of the diversity of life we see today. Of course, the etymology is a little bit different from the definition, and the definition of evolution just means change over time. If you're in a biological context, there are more specific things that happens, but you might also hear this word used in other contexts. I believe it's used in physics for a few applications. Some of my physicist friends have told me about this, not that I really understand that specific application. But if you hear the word evolution, something is changing and we are measuring over a period of time. So these are the things you want to be aware of. You want to know, like, what are we measuring? Like, what is the thing that's changing? And what is the unit of time that matters to us here? And we'll talk a little bit more about that for evolution in a bit. I wanted to share this quote with you. So here, animals engage in a struggle for existence, for resources to avoid being eaten and to breed. Environmental factors influence organisms to develop new characteristics to ensure survival, thus transforming into new species. Animals that survive to breed can pass on their successful characteristics to offspring. Many people, of course, would probably attribute this to Darwin today because, he's the big name that we throw around when we're talking about evolutionary theory. Of course, it wasn't. So this was a quote from Al-Jahiz, who lived several centuries before Darwin. And I bring this up to mention that there were centuries of evolutionary thought before Darwin. People were thinking about similar things, and it just didn't quite coalesce into the field that we know today when Darwin published On the Origin of the Species in 1859. Unfortunately, there has been a pretty thorough erasure of a lot of the history of Afro-Arabian scholars like Al-Jahiz, who is from the area that's now called Iraq, because they had centuries of really interesting mathematical and scientific research, which isn't necessarily as well known today. But that aside, let's talk about some of the evidence for evolution. There's, of course, many different things we can talk about. I like to boil them down into 4 main points. So first, that living species are well suited to their environments. If you just go to any part of the world, you might notice there are different habitats in different places, but wherever they live, most animals tend to be pretty well suited to the environment they happen to live in. We also notice that there are many deep similarities between different living organisms, and there's just a lot of them. There's so many different things out there. And we also notice that different animals have been alive at different times and different places. So let's take a moment and let's go through these one by one. So first, let's use an example of the camel to look at how camels are well suited for their environment, the desert. So first, they can close their nostrils to protect against blowing sand. If you have ever been in a sandstorm, you would appreciate this feature. They also have beautiful elongated eyelashes that again protect against blowing sand. Sand in your eyes is not particularly pleasant. They also have fat storage in their hump that helps them survive long periods without food and water. So here they store fat and water. Great. So if they need to go for a long period where they can't access either, they will be able to do that for a longer period of time than at least humans can. They also have these long legs that keep their body farther away from the really hot sand, and it helps them lose more body heat because the wind is blowing away from them. And lastly, they have these really broad pads on their feet that help prevent them sinking too far into the sand. So it's like similar idea of a snowshoe. It's just already on their feet and for sand. Because if you've ever run along the beach, you might remember that it's much harder to run on sand because your feet sink in every step. And of course, this doesn't end at camels. We can talk about most species out there and why they have different features or adaptations that help suit them to what environment they live in. Another line of evidence that we find is something called deep similarity. And these are really fundamental similarities that we find amongst all life, or you can also talk about deep similarities on animals or plants, and that these would be things that all organisms share within a particular group. But if we are talking about all life, like DNA is the hereditary material of every single living thing. We also see there is a cellular structure. The exact type of cellular structure might be different. We have prokaryotic cells, we have eukaryotic cells. There's different types of cell walls when we're comparing animal versus plant cells, but we all have this underlying cell structure. We also always see this central dogma of molecular biology where things start as DNA, it is transcribed into RNA, and then that is translated into amino acids. So the super basic function of all cells that is similar amongst all life. We also just have so many different species out there. The diversity of life is truly tremendous. Even though we keep on driving new species to extinction, there is still a lot of life out there, and we should definitely spend more time and effort preserving what we haven't killed off yet. And of course, another really cool line of evidence are fossils. And fossils, they just tell us that things were used to be different. Life used to be different, the environment used to be different, and we can also kind of trace these lines of similarity and show like, oh, that doesn't quite look like a modern horse, but that's pretty similar. And when we have a good enough fossil record, we can actually create a nice little family tree and show a progression of a really old ancestor into modern animals today. So before Darwin, all of these things were recognized, and these were the main lines of evidence that really led to understanding how Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace came up with their theories of evolution by natural selection. So let's get into it. Of course, Darwin is the main person we're going to talk about. He did publish a little bit more research, but Alfred Russel Wallace also came up with similar insights to Darwin, though he is now considered the father of biogeography. So Darwin had 3 hypotheses. We're going to talk about them one by one. We have common descent, descent with modification, and lastly, natural selection. So let's start with common descent here. Common descent means that similar organisms are going to look similar because they share features, because they all descend from a common ancestor. And if you want to extrapolate this far enough, this implies that all living things have a common ancestor. So you want to think back to the deep similarity we just talked about. This implies that we all have cells and we all have DNA, we all use that central dogma because the very first living organism had these features, so we inherited it from that ancestor. Here is one beautiful quote from Charles Darwin. Therefore, I should infer from analogy that probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some one primordial form into which life was first breathed. Some of his lines are truly poetic. And again, common descent predicts these fundamental similarities that we see amongst all life. So here we have a few examples. Here is a protein RNA polymerase. So it's helpful to make RNA, and we see similar forms of this protein in all cells. Of course, it's going to be slightly different because it's evolved to be slightly different in different species, but we still see this fundamental similarity. We also have a mostly universal genetic code. So we have these codons, a series of 3 base pairs that translate from, here we have the RNA chart translating to different amino acids. And it is mostly the same, but really there are only a few exceptions when we look at all life. Darwin's next hypothesis was descent with modification. And this is really just the idea that species will change gradually and that each generation is going to be a little bit different than the first. So here we can see a graphic that shows we're starting off with dark colored ladybugs here, and gradually they're getting more red but retaining some dark spots. Descent with modification also tells us that descendants of the same ancestor can have different appearances. So here we have our example of Darwin's finches, which are famous for many different reasons. So what we think is that one ancestral finch got blown away to the Galapagos Islands, which are not particularly close to South America, but because there were no other birds there, it was able to diversify and undergo this descent with modification, where different descendants evolved different features. Primarily here we're looking at different beak sizes and shapes because they're eating different foods. And when we extrapolate this idea farther, when we have changes that are big enough from ancestor to descendant, we get something called speciation, or the formation of a new species. And when we combine this idea with the fossil record, here's where we can get really cool stories. So here are two where we have some ancestors of modern horses and then ancestors of modern whales. We happen to have pretty good fossil records for both of these, and these are really fun stories to learn more about when looking at the fossil record. So our next one, of course, is natural selection. Natural selection takes a little bit more time to work up to. So let's first start with some of the observations that tell us about natural selection. So first, we have this struggle for existence, that there is limited food, there might be limited shelter, you have to find a mate to have offspring to make the next generation. So individuals struggle against other individuals of their same species to survive. We also know that individuals vary. So here we're looking at butterflies and we see that they vary in color. Of course, in the real world, there is much more variation than just color, but that is a nice analogy we can use for now. And we also notice that there is something called differential reproductive success, or some individuals of a species are going to have more offspring than other individuals. And when that happens in a particular way, we can get natural selection. One thing that is really important for natural selection to happen, though, is that variation, the variation we just talked about, is heritable. That means it's being able to be transmissible from parent to offspring. And really that just means children are probably going to look like their parents. So here we have blue butterflies, probably going to have blue children. Red and pink butterflies, probably going to have red and pink children. And you probably have noticed this yourself, that children in the real world tend to look like their parents. We've used the same principles for animal husbandry for hundreds of years, possibly thousands? Yeah, thousands of years for domesticated animals. So let's talk through this step by step to understand how natural selection happens. The first and most important thing is variation. Not everyone in this population is the same. If there is no variation, no evolution is happening. Once we have this variation, that variation also must be heritable. You need to be able to reliably pass on how you are different from everybody else to your offspring. Then, the variation that is also heritable it also needs to lead to differential reproduction. So some individuals that are different happen to have more offspring because what makes them different gives them an advantage for some reason. So sometimes that might mean you're stronger. Sometimes it might mean you're tinier because you can hide better. Or if you're in a food-stressed environment, you don't need as much food to survive. Really, what that thing is that gives you an advantage is highly specific to the specific example in that moment. And then, of course, we need one more generation of reproduction to happen, and boom, natural selection. And yes, I did have way too much fun animating this slide. But you can see we have these different steps, and all of them need to happen. And without all of these, natural selection isn't going to happen. But let's kind of recap this in words. Natural selection is the differential survival and reproduction of individuals due to differences in phenotype, or differences in how they are, their physical attributes. So we have another example here. So we have some bird which has a bigger, thicker beak. It's slightly less fluffy, and for whatever reason, it is more successful and it has 2 offspring, and the other bird has a slightly smaller beak, is fluffier, only has 1. And if we just go through 2 generations of that, we have completely changed the ratio of our population. Rather than having this 50-50 split, now we have 4/5 are the larger beak and 1/5 are the smaller beak. So this natural selection, this is how descent with modification occurs and how we can see this reliable change of one generation to the next. Some people also call it the mechanism for evolution. We can also use an example to understand this better, and let's use antibiotic resistance, a kind of terrifying example. So first, we're going to have a bunch of bacteria. And in this bacteria, maybe it's in you, maybe your doctor just gave you an antibiotic. If we put some drugs in it, most of them are going to die, but a few are going to survive. And here we have one bacteria which is naturally already resistant to the drug we gave it. So in this next generation, more of those bacteria are going to be resistant, and eventually we are going to get a strain which is entirely antibiotic resistant. So here we actually need to be kind of careful with how we use antibiotics, because you'll notice most of them out there say, we kill 99.9% of germs. Well, for this generation, once you use that, the next generation is more likely to be antibiotic resistant. So we do need to be careful. And this is one of the ways that knowledge of evolution and its processes can affect our real lives. It has been fascinating watching the evolution of the coronavirus, but I have been super happy that for every couple of months I see another article that's talking to a reputable evolutionary biologist, because these are the people who have the knowledge that can tell us how things are going to change over time. And I have a couple friends who come to me and like, so when do you think it's going to be over? I'm like, yeah, you're cute that you think it's going to end. Anyway, another important thing we get from Darwin is this idea of population thinking. So more than just our 3 hypotheses, Darwin kind of completely changed how we think about the natural world outside. Another thing Darwin told us is that instead of just looking at one individual, and before Darwin, what naturalists would tend to go do is they'd go out, they'd collect a bunch of individuals of whatever species they were looking at, and they would just find which one was prettiest, and that's the one they would bring back to the museum. But Darwin is instead telling us, instead of just finding that one perfect individual to base all of our research off of for that one species, we actually need to look at multiple individuals, and that the entire population matters, the variation itself matters, and there isn't one ideal for anything. Great thing that we should apply to more than just evolution. So one of the reasons why this happens, if we think back to our levels of biological organization, which I love as a great way to understand, like, what am I talking about? What level am I discussing here? Darwin is telling us that evolution happens here at the level of the population. And in my opinion, part of the problem that it took so long for people to figure out like what was going on with evolution and to figure this out is previous naturalists were actually looking at organisms, a smaller level of organization, and that's why people just didn't realize what was going on because they were looking at a too small level of biological organization to see the entire pattern. So here we can go back to our definition of evolution. Evolution is simply a change in a population over time. Of course, Darwin published The Origin of Species over 150 years ago. We've learned a few things since then, and the next important thing to talk about is the study of inheritance. Of course, now we are talking about the field of genetics, and genetics just means the study of heredity. We are looking at the variations of characteristics that are passed down from one generation to the next. I'm sure you guys have heard of him before, but now we are talking about Gregor Mendel, an Austrian monk who lived in the 1800s. Strangely, he was actually a contemporary of Darwin, but just because of some oddities, he ended up publishing in a rather obscure journal. He wasn't actually really discovered and understood by the broader community until about 1900. So even though he was a actual contemporary of Darwin, he was functionally after Darwin if we're talking about the understanding by the broader scientific community. But anyway, Mendel, he was the father of genetics. He did super meticulous experiments with the common garden pea. Every time I read about all of the experiments he did and all of these like very careful, like I'm going to breed these plants and like very carefully monitor all these crossbreeds, I'm like, wow, that's amazing. Also, I never want to do that myself. One of the things I've learned from anthropology is the basis of society is the division of labor. So be grateful for the people who are willing to do the things that you deem too tedious. Thanks again, Gregor Mendel. Again, we are not going to learn every single intricacy of what Mendel did, but it is helpful to understand a few basic details. Mendel was looking at 7 different traits. So we're looking at flower color, the plant height, seed color, seed shape, pod color, pod shape, and flower position. And so we have a couple different traits, and each of these traits come in 2 forms. So, your flowers can be purple or white. Your plant can be tall or short. All of these different combinations. We're not going to think about all 7 of them today. Really, let's focus on plant height. Because sometimes when you just want to understand the very basics, you want to just boil it down to one example. One of the most important things we got from Mendel, in my opinion, is how heredity works. Before Mendel came around, there was this idea called the blending model, that you have a father, you have a mother, they have a baby, and the baby is the exact average between them. So if we're talking about plant height, we should get, if we have a tall plant and a short plant, then all of the offspring should be medium. Do we get that? Not at all. Instead, Mendel showed that we actually get this weird ratio of 3 tall plants to 1 short plant. So we're not getting any medium plants at all. And this told us that instead of this idea of blending inheritance, we get something called particulate inheritance. That now we have the inheritance of discrete characters via genes that are all independently expressed. Of course, we just have a bunch of different genes, and each gene might just have a super tiny effect, so it can seem overall like blending inheritance, but when you start to look at it, it is actually the inheritance of tiny little different discrete characters. Of course, when we're talking about genetics, now we have this entire new vocabulary to learn, so here are some important words that will come up if you are learning about genetics. First, we have the idea of genotypes. So it's like, what alleles of the genes do you have at a particular location? So here, if you are homozygous, homo means same, you have the same allele at that location. So here we have 2 homozygous individuals, but one has these uppercase letters, those are the dominant genes, or we have these lowercase letters, these are our recessive genes. Or you can be heterozygous, and you can have 2 different alleles at that one point. Of course, I've mentioned this word a couple times. We should probably define it. Genes. Genes are the basis of Mendel's idea of genetics and heredity. If we're going back to Mendel, it's just the unit of heredity. It's kind of this amorphous definition. If you go a little bit later in time, you might hear a gene is a specific sequence in the genome that codes for a protein. So now we're getting super specific. But now that we're starting to learn more about genes and the genome, the definition is actually starting to get kind of more general again, because what is a gene is starting to get a little bit more confusing and very situation specific. So I also just like to zoom back out, and a gene is this molecular unit of heredity. The example we have up on the screen here is hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is kind of cool because we have these 4 different subunits, which are all very similar, but they are different and they each have their own sequence. So what's the gene? Is there one gene with 4 subparts within it, or do we have 4 different genes? So that is just one example, but you can start to see why the exact definition of a gene might be a little bit hazy. A few other things that you want to know and be comfortable with around genetics is the idea of genes, alleles, and loci. A gene is the trait in question. So we could have a gene for eye color. A note, it's another oversimplification. There are multiple genes that affect your eye color, but for a moment, pretend there's just one. And apparently this organism has alleles or different versions of the gene for red eyes or blue eyes. Not entirely sure what animal I'm trying to imagine here, but let's pretend. And then our locus is the physical location on the chromosome. So gene can also be kind of amorphous. Locus, we tend to use that where we're just talking about a place in the genome. So if you're talking about this general concept, you'll see that come out a lot in modern genetics papers. So now that we've kind of incorporated a little bit from Mendel, this understanding of heredity, because remember, heredity is integral to Darwin's evolution by natural selection. Darwin just didn't know how heredity worked. Now we can go back to our definition of evolution and update it. So if you are talking about the population genetic definition of evolution, it is change in allele frequency between generations. If you are in a biology class today, this is probably the most common definition of evolution you will run into. Personally, I still like to be a little bit more general. I like to say evolution is change in a population over time, but that's because there's a lot more data that we can look at than just change in allele frequency. So here is an example. Peter and Rosemary Grant went back to the Galapagos Islands in the 1970s because they're like, hey, we want to see what Darwin saw. Let's study these finches again. And they had many wonderful things come out, but my personal favorite and very common example in evolutionary classrooms is their investigation into this microevolution of the medium ground finch. So here we're looking at 2 different graphs looking at the average beak depth, basically how tall their beak is, between 1976 and 1978. The first thing you should notice between these 2 graphs is the blue one is a lot bigger. There's just so many more individuals in this population. And in 1978, a lot of them have died. Ooh, that's not good. What happened here is there was a drought. And of course, an effect of the drought is a lot of them died. There just wasn't as much food during the drought. So many of them were not able to get as the food they needed to survive. But you'll also notice more than just the numbers in their population, there's been a shift of the average value of beak depth. So in 1978, after this drought, most individuals have a larger beak on average than they did before the drought. So this is an example of microevolution. But also, we're not measuring allele frequency here. This is evolution. It's probably controlled by genes. But personally, I would simply call this a change in the population because we aren't actually measuring allele frequency. This is an area where I might differ from other evolutionary biologists. Some people would prefer to just use the change in allele frequency, but this is one way I like to be careful with my words. Of course, evolutionary theory itself is also evolving. We are today mostly talked about pretty old stuff. And there are many new theories that have come up in the past 50 or so years that I have not covered at all. So just a short example, very short list of some other things that are really exciting and have been added to our understanding of evolution are things like niche construction theory, punctuated equilibrium, phenotypic plasticity, epigenetics, the entire field of Evo-Devo. So all of these things are ways that we are adding to our understanding of evolution. And I feel like every day and every time I read a new publication, it's getting more complex. And I find that really exciting. Evolution is not a simple process. There are so many different things and processes going on, and it's this agglomeration of all of these different things interacting, and that's one of the reasons that I find it exciting. So if you want to learn more about these things, here are a couple keywords that you can go and search out. Of course, one thing that is important to understand is evolution is not survival of the fittest. I have very strong opinions about this. But I also have an entire other video about this. You can go watch that rant elsewhere. I do, of course, want to end this on a slightly happier note. Really, the purpose of evolution is to explain the diversity of life. Why are there so many cool species out there? So the goal of evolution, and really why people are drawn to this, is they go outside and like, what's that weird thing? Can I learn more about it? So why is this thing weird? Why is this thing cool? If any of those things sound exciting, I recommend you should learn more about evolutionary biology. Because this field is so vast, there are, of course, many wonderful resources out there for you. There's a couple of popular science books I like to recommend. So Neil Shubin's Your Inner Fish is a wonderful book that walks through his discovery. He was part of the team that discovered Tiktaalik, a great early tetrapod ancestor, but he does a great narrative of the discovery, but also of comparative anatomy and giving us an idea of kind of this deep similarity with other tetrapods. Why Evolution is True is by Jerry Coyne. He is one of my heroes. He writes so well, and this book is incredibly straightforward. It's like, okay, here's some evidence for evolution and what it means. So if you're not quite grasping some of these basic things and want to understand the evidence behind it, this is the book for you. Lastly, we have Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. So this one's a little bit more about humans and why different situations and different environments of different parts of the world have led to slightly different societies and slightly different opportunities. Of course, if you don't want to buy a book, there are still a bunch of great free resources out there. Berkeley has this wonderful website called Evolution 101, and they just have a bunch of different topics here, and it walks you through all of them. Slightly different, we have Khan Academy, Evolution, and the Tree of Life. I find the information on both of these is very similar, but it's just formatted in a slightly different way. So if you want to go the internet route, I would recommend look at both of these and then just figure out which one makes more sense to you and then read through that. Of course, it is always good to test yourself. So after this, can you describe what is evolution? And what are some of the important components of evolution?